Vivid verses.
I've always believed that people show you who they are in the small moments, not the grand gestures, not the curated highlight reels they post online, but the quiet Tuesday evenings when they think no one is paying close attention. I was paying close attention. My name is Connor Reeves, and I run a digital products and licensing business from a converted loft apartment in the Westfield district of Culver City. I say converted loft because that's what it genuinely is. Exposed brick, high ceilings, the original iron window frames that the building's previous owner, a furniture manufacturer named Horvath, installed sometime in the 1960s. I didn't hire a designer to make it look industrial. It actually is industrial. I just filled it with things I like: a long oak desk, good speakers, a leather reading chair that cost me more than my first car, and a kitchen I actually cook in. I'm 31 years old. I started my first online business at 24 in a studio apartment that smelled permanently of someone else's cooking, running everything from a laptop balanced on a folding table. By 27, I had scaled 2 separate digital product lines to consistent 6-figure months. By 29, I had crossed into what accountants describe with raised eyebrows and careful language. I don't broadcast it. I drive a 4-year-old Keller G40, a solid, unpretentious sedan, and I wear clothes that fit well but don't announce themselves. Money, to me, has always been a resource for building freedom, not a costume for performing status. I mention all of this not to establish myself, but because context matters when you're trying to understand why a relationship that should have been straightforward became something I needed to dismantle with surgical precision on a Wednesday evening in early October. I met Vivian Ashworth at a dinner party hosted by my friend Theo Barnard at his townhouse on Callaway Street. Theo is an architect, the kind who designs real buildings rather than rendering concepts that never get built, and he throws exactly the kind of dinners I enjoy: 8 to 12 people, good food actually cooked by someone who knows what they're doing, and conversations that don't stay on the surface for long. Vivian arrived with a mutual acquaintance named Petra, wearing a deep burgundy dress and carrying herself with the kind of deliberate composure that suggested she practiced it. She was striking: dark hair, sharp features, a smile that appeared at carefully chosen moments. She worked in brand strategy, she told me, at a firm called Harlow and Associates. Corner office, client-facing work with some of the city's mid-tier luxury brands. She asked good questions that first evening. She listened well, or appeared to. She laughed at the right moments and disagreed with me once, something about urban development policy, in a way that was confident without being combative. I was interested. I asked for her number before the dessert plates were cleared. We dated for 4 months. In those 4 months, I learned a great deal about Vivian Ashworth. Some of what I learned came from what she told me. The rest came from observation, a habit I've never been able to turn off and have long since stopped trying to. She lived in a 6th-floor apartment in the Crestline building on Faro Avenue, which is the kind of address that carries weight in Culver City. The apartment was immaculate. White walls, curated art, a kitchen island made of a single slab of Calicut marble. The kind of space that photographs in 15 seconds and looks like it was styled for a magazine. She told me she'd furnished it herself over 2 years, piece by piece, and I had no immediate reason to question this. She were good things. A Marceau leather bag that I knew retailed at around $4,000. Shoes from a French label called Disvine that I'd seen in windows but never examined closely. A watch, a Learn Classique, the thin gold-cased one, that sat quietly on her wrist and probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. None of this struck me as unusual in isolation. Culver City has no shortage of people who earn well and spend accordingly. What began to accumulate was subtler. The first inconsistency was a comment made during our second month together. We were walking back from dinner at Sato 11, a Japanese restaurant on Glenmore that I've been going to for years, and Vivian made an offhand remark about how she was glad her lease renewal was handled by her property manager, so she never had to worry about negotiating it herself. An innocuous statement, but it snagged on something in my mind, because in the same week she had described picking out her apartment and negotiating the terms directly with the building's leasing office. Small detail, could be a misremembrance. I filed it and moved on. The second inconsistency arrived during month 3. She'd invited me to what she called a work function, a cocktail evening at Harlow and Associates office space in the Brendan Tower. I attended expecting to see her in her element, meeting colleagues, playing the room with the ease that senior professionals tend to display at these things. What I saw was different. She stood at the edge of conversations more than she led them. When I was introduced to a woman named Celia, who worked in the same department, I watched Celia's expression move through something, a flicker of correction, perhaps of recalibration, before she smiled and said it was nice to meet me. Later, in the car, I asked Vivian how long Celia had been at the firm. "She's fairly junior," Vivian said. "Started about the same time I did." I didn't comment. I noted. The third inconsistency was the one that settled it for me. We were at Theo's again, a smaller dinner, just 6 of us, and the conversation moved to property. Someone mentioned the Crestline building specifically, as it had recently changed ownership, and there was talk of a new management increasing service charges. Vivian said something about how her unit wasn't affected because of how her agreement was structured. Theo, casually, genuinely, without any agenda, said, "Oh, your parents own one of the units there, don't they?" I thought I remembered that from years ago. Vivian's response was a half-second too slow, and the redirect came a half-second too smooth. "They did a while back. I moved in after. You know how it is with these buildings, they all blur together." She touched her wine glass. She didn't look at me. Theo moved on. The conversation moved on. I did not move on. I sat across from her at that dinner table and completed the picture that had been assembling itself in my peripheral vision for weeks. The apartment she described negotiating, her parents, the wardrobe that cycled with suspicious regularity, certain pieces appearing and then disappearing, likely rented from one of the designer hire services that had become popular in cities where image maintenance was practically a professional skill. The job at Harlow and Associates, I had never actually verified her title. I'd assumed. She'd implied. There's a meaningful difference between those two things. None of this made Vivian Ashworth a bad person. It made her someone performing a life she didn't actually have. What made her difficult to continue dating was something else entirely. The complaints had started around the 6-week mark. Gently at first. A comment here, an observation there, the kind of low-level friction that exists in most new relationships and usually dissipates as people settle into each other. But Vivian's complaints had a particular character. They were always directed at my life, my choices, my habits, with the implicit suggestion that hers were superior. My apartment was a lot. She said this while looking at my bookshelves with an expression that suggested she found their volume slightly embarrassing. My work schedule was isolating. I worked until 7 most evenings when I had momentum, a habit that had funded the freedom I now lived inside, and she regularly described it as a personality deficiency rather than a choice. My car was sensible, said in the way people say sensible when they mean boring. My preference for small dinners over large social events was limiting. My lack of interest in a particular set of Calder City social circles, the one she apparently circulated in or aspired to, I was never entirely clear which, was closed off. I want to be clear about something. I didn't absorb these comments silently. I'm not built for that. When she said something that required a response, I gave one, straightforwardly, without drama, and without apology. When she described my work schedule as isolating, I told her that I disagreed, that I had built a structure that gave me more genuine freedom than almost any office-bound career could offer, and that I had no intention of changing it. She nodded in a way that suggested she was agreeing while privately maintaining her position. When she described my apartment as a lot, I told her I liked it and that I'd chosen everything in it deliberately. She smiled and changed the subject. She never pushed back when I responded. She didn't argue. She simply filed her critique and waited, and then issued another one a few weeks later, as if the previous one had just been preliminary. What I found most telling wasn't the complaints themselves. It was the architecture of them. Every criticism of my life arrived packaged with an implicit comparison to her own. Her apartment with its clean lines and curated surfaces, her professional trajectory, her wardrobe that always looked like a statement. She wasn't just expressing preferences. She was running a comparison and positioning herself as the superior term. This, combined with what I now knew about the actual contents of that life she was holding up as a standard, had arrived at a natural conclusion. I decided to end it. I want to be precise about my process here, because I think the process matters. I didn't end it out of anger. I've never operated well from anger. It's imprecise, it causes unnecessary debris, and it usually means the other person walks away feeling like a victim rather than understanding what actually happened. I didn't end it out of wounded pride, though I'd be dishonest if I said the ongoing comparisons hadn't registered. I ended it because I had completed a clear-eyed assessment of who Vivian Ashworth was, how she operated, and what continuing would require of me. And the calculation was straightforward. I texted her on a Tuesday afternoon and asked if she was free Wednesday evening. She said yes. I told her I'd come by her place at 7. Wednesday arrived the way October evenings do in Calder City. Early darkness, a cold that has intention behind it, the city settling into its autumn version of itself. I drove the Keller down Faro Avenue, found parking on the street, and took the elevator to the 6th floor. Vivian answered the door in a soft cream blouse and dark trousers, the learned classique on her wrist, hair down. She looked good. She'd clearly made an effort, which meant she'd read the purpose of my visit differently than I'd intended it. I noticed this. I didn't comment on it. "You want tea?" "I just put water on," she said, stepping back to let me in. "I'm fine, thanks." The apartment looked the same as always. The marble island, the curated wall, the carefully positioned objects. I'd stood in this space a dozen times, and each time it had felt slightly like standing inside a photograph of an apartment rather than inside the apartment itself. I understood now why. I sat down on the white sofa. She sat across from me, tucking one leg underneath her in the way she did when she was trying to appear relaxed. "So," she said with a small smile, "you have your thinking face on." "I want to talk about us," I said. A brief recalibration crossed her features. Not alarm, more like someone adjusting to a slight change in temperature. "Okay, I've been doing a lot of thinking over the past few weeks," I said, "and I've arrived at something I want to be straight with you about. I want to end the relationship." The word arrived with appropriate weight. She absorbed it. "End it," she said, not quite a question. "Yes." "Can I ask why?" I had prepared for this, the way I prepare for most things, not scripting it, but understanding the terrain. "I'll be honest with you, because I think you deserve honesty, and I'd want the same if our positions were reversed. Over the past few months, you've expressed a lot of criticism about my life. My apartment, my work schedule, my car, my social choices. Regularly, and always in a way that compare my life unfavorably to yours. I've addressed it each time it came up, and each time it's come back in some new form." She opened her mouth. I continued. "I don't say this with any particular resentment. I understand that people have different values and different ideas about how a life should look. But I've realized that we're incompatible and that this specific pattern, The ongoing critique of how I live against a backdrop that positions your life as the standard worth measuring against is something I'm not willing to continue navigating. A silence settled between us, the kind that has texture. I've never meant it as criticism, she said eventually. Her voice was careful. I was just sharing my perspective. I know you believe that, I said. But perspective, delivered consistently in one direction, starts to function as criticism regardless of intent. She looked at the far wall. I could see the thoughts organizing themselves behind her eyes, which angle to take, which version of this conversation to pursue. This is something I've noticed about Vivian. She was a strategic thinker in social situations, which is a genuinely useful quality, but it also meant that her first response to most things was to calculate rather than simply react. Under normal circumstances, I find that kind of composure admirable. In this moment, it told me she was deciding how to argue rather than deciding whether to accept what I'd said. I think you're being unfair, she said. I've been supportive of you. In some ways, yes, I said, because that was true and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But you're reducing 4 months to... The door opened. I hadn't heard a key in the lock, which meant it had already been unlocked, which meant someone else had a key. We both turned. The woman who walked in was perhaps 25, carrying a canvas bag and wearing the expression of someone who had not expected to walk into anything complicated. She stopped when she saw me. Then she looked at Vivian. Her name, I would learn in approximately 45 seconds, was Danny. Oh, she said. Sorry, the door was unlocked, so She looked at Vivian. Is this a bad time? Vivian had gone very still. Not the strategic stillness of earlier. This was something different. This was the stillness of someone who has just watched 2 separate parts of their life enter the same room. Danny, Vivian said, with a kind of controlled quietness that told me a great deal. Now isn't great. I just need to grab the blue Marquetti jacket. I need it for tomorrow, the rental return, as Danny stopped. Something had landed in the room, and she'd felt it. She looked between the two of us. Should I come back? The word rental had arrived and placed itself quietly in the center of the room, like an object set down on a table. I looked at Danny. You live here? She glanced at Vivian. A flicker, the hesitation of someone realizing they may have already said something they shouldn't have. I'm her roommate, she said, as if the word required careful handling. I turned back to Vivian. Her jaw was set. She was looking at Danny with an expression that would have communicated volumes to anyone fluent in it. Vivian, I said, keeping my voice entirely even. You told me you lived alone. A pause. The pause of calculation meeting its limits. Danny stays here sometimes, she said. Danny, to her credit, or perhaps simply to her discomfort, made a small sound that was not quite agreement. She had set her canvas bag down on the kitchen counter and was now very still herself, in the manner of someone who has concluded that the least movement will result in the least consequence. Sometimes, I said. Vivian looked at me steadily. It's complicated. I thought about the property manager comment. The lease negotiation she described directly. Theo's offhand mention of her parents' connection to the building. A unit in the Crestline building on Faro Avenue, renting at somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000 a month, depending on floor and aspect. I thought about the Marceau bag and the Desvine shoes and the Learn Classique watch and the way certain pieces of her wardrobe appeared in rotation and then disappeared. The word rental, offered by Danny with the casualness of someone for whom it was simply a logistical fact. I didn't perform a reaction. I didn't need to. It's all right, I said, and I meant it, which I think surprised both of them. You don't have to explain. Connor, the apartment belongs to your parents, I said. Not a question. Calmly, the way you might state a fact you've known for long enough that it no longer carries any charge. The wardrobe, some of it is rented. I looked at her. In your position at Harlow & Associates. What's the actual title? The silence had a different quality now. Danny had moved slightly backward, positioning herself closer to the hallway that presumably led to the bedrooms. The instinct of someone trying to exit a space without technically leaving it. Vivian held my gaze for a long moment. I could see the sequence of it, the consideration of denial, the assessment of how much I already knew, the arrival at something that was not quite resignation, but was adjacent to it. "Brand coordinator," she said finally. Her voice was level. Whatever else was true about Vivian, she had composure. "Entry level. I've been there 14 months. I nodded. "The apartment is my parents'," she continued. And now that she'd started, the voice had moved into something almost flat, like a document being read aloud. "They bought it years ago, and I've been living here since I graduated. And yes, I use a rental service for some pieces. The Marceau bag was a gift. That part's real." She paused. "The watch is my mother's." Danny had found something very interesting to look at on the kitchen counter. I sat with what she'd said for a moment. Not performing consideration, actually considering it. The architecture of what she'd built. A brand coordinator in an entry-level role. Living in a parent-owned apartment in a building she'd implied she'd chosen and negotiated for herself. Renting designer pieces to maintain the surface of a wardrobe that suggested a salary she wasn't earning. An entire structural performance of a life pitched a decade ahead of where she actually was. And then the months of criticism. My apartment, which I owned. My car, which I owned. My work schedule, which had built a business generating millions in annual revenue, quietly, without fanfare, from a converted loft that she described as a lot, with the faint condescension of someone who believed their own aesthetic was the correct one. I stood up. "I appreciate you telling me," I said, and I was careful to mean this, because it was the truest thing available. I know that wasn't easy. She was watching me with something I couldn't immediately categorize. Not shame, exactly, and not defiance. Something more complex. Something like the expression of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just set it down and isn't sure how they feel about the absence of the weight. "You knew," she said, "before tonight." "I had a strong sense of it," I said. "And you still came." "I came to end things cleanly," I said. The rest of it unfolded on its own. She glanced toward Danny, who had the grace to look genuinely apologetic and the wisdom to say nothing. "Connor," Vivian's voice was quiet. "I want you to understand, it was never about deceiving you specifically. I've been living this way before I met you. It was just the version I'd constructed." "I understand that," I said. "I do. Building a version of yourself that feels more substantial than the one you currently have. I understand the impulse. Most people have some version of that." I moved toward the door, then stopped. There was something I needed to say, and I was going to say it plainly, without cruelty and without softening it past the point of truth. "I want to be clear about something," I said, turning back to face her. "Not to wound you, but because I think you should hear it." She waited. "The business I run," I said. "The one I work on until 7 in the evenings, the one you described as isolating, the one that didn't seem to fit your idea of what a worthwhile professional life looks like. It generates millions annually. It has for several years. The apartment you called a lot is mine. The car you called sensible is paid for in cash. And I chose it because I prefer it to the alternative." I paused. "I'm not telling you this to embarrass you. I'm telling you because for 4 months you compare my life unfavorably to a life that doesn't exist." The room was very quiet. Vivian looked at me, and this was the most unguarded I'd ever seen her face. The composure was still there, because composure that deep is structural rather than decorative, and it doesn't simply dissolve. But behind it something had shifted. Recognition, perhaps. Or the particular discomfort of understanding exactly how a situation looks in retrospect. "Danny," against all odds, made herself even smaller. I would have preferred the real you, I said. I said it simply, without ornament, because the simple version was the true version, and the true version was the only one worth saying. I don't care about corner offices, or what building you live in, or whether your watch belongs to your mother. None of that would have mattered to me. But I can't be with someone who is hypocritical and can't be honest about who they are. I picked up my jacket from the arm of the sofa. I hope you figure out the life you actually want, I said. Not the one that photographs well. The one you'd choose if no one was watching. I left. The elevator down was quiet. I stood in it and looked at my reflection in the brushed steel doors, distorted slightly, the way reflections in elevator doors always are, as if the metal is showing you a version of yourself that's slightly negotiable. And I thought about what had just happened with the same methodical clarity I bring to most things. There was no satisfaction in it. I want to be precise about that. Some people in some versions of this story would feel a clean, clarifying pleasure at the moment of exposure, the moment of reversal. I knew, you didn't know I knew, and now here we are. I didn't feel that. What I felt was something quieter and somewhat wearier. The mild fatigue of a conclusion that had been building for months and had finally arrived. I thought about the version of Vivian that might exist beneath the version I dated. The brand coordinator 14 months into an entry-level role, probably smarter than the job currently required of her. Living in a space she hadn't earned yet, wearing borrowed things, performing a destination she hadn't reached. I didn't dislike that person. In many ways, I found that person more interesting than the polished construction I'd been presented with for 4 months. That was the honest part of what I'd said. I would have preferred the real version. What I couldn't work with, what had made this ending necessary before I'd even known the full extent of it, was the hypocrisy, not the performance itself, which is human and understandable and probably more common than anyone admits, but the simultaneous performance of superiority. You cannot critique someone else's life from inside a fabrication of your own. You cannot hold a mirror up to someone else's supposed deficiencies when you're standing on a foundation you didn't build. Not if you expect them to stay. I had a code about this. It wasn't a rigid one, not a set of rules posted somewhere and consulted regularly, but a working orientation I developed over years of watching what worked and what didn't in my own behavior and in the behavior of people I respected. The core of it was simple. Know what you actually have, be honest about it, build from there. Don't perform forward. Don't construct a self that's contingent on other people not looking closely. I had built a business from nothing, in a studio apartment, on a folding table, without a family property to live in rent-free or a wardrobe that broadcast a level of success I hadn't yet achieved. The building had taken years and been genuinely difficult, and I had done it, and the result was a life I'd chosen in full and could account for completely. When Vivian looked at my apartment and found it lacking, she was looking at something I'd earned with eyes that were, it turned out, borrowed. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd have been content without it being lost on her, too. I drove back along Faro Avenue, out through the Westfield district, and parked in the underground space beneath my building. I took the stairs rather than the elevator, a habit, nothing more, and let myself into the apartment. The bookshelves were still there, their volume apparently undiminished by Vivian's aesthetic reservations. The leather chair, the oak desk with its 3 monitors, one of which showed a dashboard I'd been tracking before I left, revenue from a new licensing deal running slightly ahead of projection. The exposed brick, the iron windows, the city outside them, dark and lit, cold and occupied. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen counter and drank it. My phone showed 2 messages, one from Theo, something about a dinner next week, and one from a business contact in another time zone asking about a revision to a contract term. I answered the contract message first because it was time sensitive, then replied to Theo confirming I was in. I didn't think about Vivian in the deliberate way you think about something you're trying to process. I thought about her the way you think about something that's been resolved, present for a moment in the way that closed things sometimes are, and then simply part of the background. I had said what I needed to say. She had heard it. That was the best any of us can do. The dashboard blinked quietly on the screen. The brick was the same brick it had always been. The city went on being the city, which it is very practiced at and does exceptionally well. I finished my coffee, sat down at the desk, and went back to work. 3 weeks later, I ran into Danny. This was not something I'd anticipated or arranged. I was at a coffee place called Reston's on Glenmore, a narrow space, good espresso, the kind of place that doesn't try to be anything other than what it is, waiting for a takeout order when I heard my name and turned to find her at the counter, her own order apparently just completed, looking at me with the expression of someone who wasn't sure if they were welcome in this particular encounter. "Connor," she said. She was carrying a laptop bag and looked like someone who had been working for several hours and had left the office for coffee to reset. "Hi." "Hey, Danny." A brief pause in which both of us assessed the situation. "I wanted to say," she started. "You don't have to," I said. "I know. She took a breath, and it had the quality of something she'd been thinking about for a while. "I didn't know she'd told you she lived alone. I didn't know what she told you about the job, I should say, I've been her roommate for 2 years, and I like her, and I should have," she stopped. "I just didn't know what she told you. I would have been more careful." I looked at her. She was clearly uncomfortable, but not in a performative way, in the genuine way of someone who has a conscience and it's been giving them moderate trouble for 3 weeks. "It's all right," I said, genuinely. "I'm not looking for an explanation or an apology. It worked out the way it needed to." She nodded, seemed to absorb this. "She's okay," she offered then, as if uncertain whether this was something I wanted, but offering it anyway. "In case you were, she's okay." "Good," I said, and I meant it. My order was called. I collected it, and Danny and I exchanged the brief nod of two people whose connection has been circumstantial and has now concluded, and I walked out onto Glenmore and turned toward the car. It was a cold morning, the kind that's honest about itself, not pretending to be warmer than it is, not dressing itself up in any ambient comfort it doesn't genuinely have. Just the temperature it is, direct and clear. I appreciated that about it. I walked the half block to the Keller, got in, set the coffee in the cup holder, and pulled out into Glenmore traffic. The dashboard of the car was clean and functional. The heater did exactly what it was supposed to do. The road was the road. On the way back, I thought about something I'd read years ago. I don't remember where, some book or article that I've mostly forgotten, but for this one sentence, about how the most unsustainable thing you can build is a version of yourself designed to impress people who are looking at the wrong things. The point being that the construction requires constant maintenance because it has no real foundation, and the maintenance costs more than the impression is worth. I hadn't always lived by this. There were years in my mid-20s when I cared more about appearance than I'd like to admit. Not to the degree Vivian had, but more than was useful, more than was honest. At some point, the calculation had simply shifted. Building the actual thing takes the same energy as performing the version of the thing, and the actual thing, once built, stays built. I pulled into the underground parking, cut the engine, and sat for a moment in the quiet. Vivian was okay. That was good. I hoped she figured out the distance between who she was performing and who she was, and I hoped the gap was smaller than she thought. I hoped the brand coordinator job turned into something, or turned into something else, or turned into whatever it was supposed to turn into for her specifically. I hoped the apartment became hers eventually, in the earned sense rather than the inherited one. Not because the inherited version was wrong, but because I thought she'd feel better standing in it. These were genuine hopes, offered from the distance of someone who had exited cleanly and wished her no particular harm. I got out of the car and took the stairs. The work was waiting. The desk was waiting. The city outside the iron windows was doing what it always does, moving, breathing, being what it is without apology. That was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough.
Thanks for listening.